Friday, October 3rd. First Friday, if you get a chance to go out tonight downtown, it's a lot of fun. We are here convened to hear a work session or have a work session on 2025-94, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 21.03, review and approval procedures in Chapter 13, nonconformities to allow more flexibility for reconstruction or rehabilitation of nonconforming structures, as well as AO 2025-112, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapters 2103, 2104, 2105, 2106, 2107, 2111, 2113, and 2115 to allow more flexibility for small forms of housing and relocatable dwelling units in manufactured home parks in all residential zones. We are on the schedule from 12:05 to 1:05. I don't know why we did 12:05, but we did. We will start with, it is now 12:08. We'll start with introductions. Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Aaron Baldwin Day.
Zach Johnson.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Yarrow Silvers.
We're joined by Mr. McKenna Foster from the Planning Department, as was Ms. Lang from the Department of Law, or the Municipal Attorney's Office. And this work session was requested by Ms. Brawley. So Ms. Brawley, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. So there's two ordinances here, and then I would turn to the planning staff to talk through the details of those. And then I do have amendments on one of them, but I'll frame both of these as one, as we know, there are a lot of challenges in our zoning code that we are revisiting and trying to address because we have found several barriers to building, but also the issue of what we do with buildings that already exist, many of which may predate a particular zoning code and or our current zoning codes make it more difficult to rehab those structures, put a new accessory dwelling unit on the same structure, right? It's getting in the way of folks trying to do something with our aging housing stock, which we know half our buildings were built in the 70s and 80s, residential buildings. And so it's a huge problem. And we are old enough as a city that we need to look at what happens when we have codes that are newer than our buildings. So this is maybe not the first time we've been here, but much older cities have already dealt with this, even before zoning existed. So anyway, all that to say, I think these are both related topics. I think my amendments only relate to one of the ordinances, but the topic of what to do with setbacks has come up in both of the mobile home discussion and this discussion. But with that, I would actually turn to planning staff to really educate us on what these do. And then maybe we can come back to my amendments at the end.
Mr. McKenna Foster.
Thank you, members. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. This is Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning. I will go through a quick overview of the relocatable dwelling units ordinance AO 2025-112. And okay. So what problems is this AO attempting to solve? It's trying to do a lot. There's a lot that went into this, and we spent a lot of time working on it, but there's been a lot of collaboration with fire department or fire safety review and development services and coming up to this, and mayor's office and working with some other projects. So this ordinance is doing a lot. So first thing, clear up confusion about and standardize code language about mobile homes, manufactured homes, tiny homes, modular homes. Currently in the code, it's not always clear. It's especially not always clear for the public when people come in and say, can I do a tiny house? Can I do a modular house? So that was one of the initial pieces of this. To make it easier, and I should say that it's also introducing a new definition, the relocatable dwelling unit. So that is sort of taking all those terms and saying, if it's relocatable, it's a relocatable dwelling unit. So a manufactured home, if it's on a foundation, it's just a home. So I'll be referring to them as RDUs or relocatable dwelling units or relocatable dwelling unit communities. So this ordinance would also make it easier to repair existing relocatable dwelling units or replace them with other safe forms of housing. That's a big thing throughout this process, and I'll talk about a little bit later or in the next slide about the timeline to getting here, is that currently the code does not allow you to put anything in a mobile home or a manufactured housing park except for a HUD certified mobile home. And the problem is in Anchorage, there just aren't that many of them. In Alaska, there aren't that many of them. They're really hard to bring up here now. They're not being produced here anymore. So when we lose mobile home parks or mobile homes in mobile home parks, you can't replace it with anything except for this very specific type of factory built structure. Another thing is it allows relocatable dwelling units with foundations in more places across the bowl. So there are changes to the use table. It makes it easier to create new relocatable dwelling unit parks in places that are already allowed. So it doesn't change the zones where relocatable dwelling unit parks or mobile home parks are allowed. It just goes from conditional use to site plan review for those uses, and it reduces the lot size minimums in existing parks. So already we've heard from people somebody who had an existing park, they said, we have some lots that are non-conforming lots within this park and we haven't been able to place new mobile homes in there. And this actually addresses that. So it brings down the lot size minimum required for a mobile home or a relocatable dwelling unit. Doesn't change the fire separation distance. It doesn't change the fire safety requirements. And again, a lot of this ordinance is really leaning on building services to permit and inspect things to be safe. So really focusing on them to deal with safety and us to deal with sort of allowing more housing. And then finally, the ordinance expands what's allowable in PLI zones. PLI zones are public lands institution zones, generally publicly owned land. And so by expanding flexibility there, the thinking is generally on public land for public land decisions, there's always going to be more process. So it's moving the process from sort of the department or the PZC level to more likely to the assembly level when figuring out what to do with that land or whatever public process comes out of any sort of use of public land.
I have a quick question before you move on to the next slide. So we have accessory dwelling units, ADUs, now relocatable dwelling units, RDUs. What is a primary dwelling unit called in our code? Like an actual one bedroom apartment or a single apartment in an apartment building or a house? Is it a primary dwelling unit? What is the term?
Yeah, I think it would be the primary dwelling unit. And it's tricky because in zoning code and building code, they just call it a dwelling unit. Currently, building code just calls an accessory dwelling unit, just a dwelling unit. But yeah, that also gets a little bit deeper into zoning, where in some zones you can have multiple primary structures in the lot, so it doesn't really matter. In other zones, it's really important what the primary structure is.
Well, I think what this is getting to though is like the conversation about how many dwelling units we need to construct in order to meet the need. And so we probably want to at some point to standardize some language around what we're calling all of these units for the purpose of getting to a final product of 10,000 units. And so probably it's good to streamline in our system kind of a lexicon of uniform terms. So just a thought. Thank you. Anyone else before he moves on? Okay, and I would note Mr. Gerker joined us at 12:11.
Yeah, and that's actually in previous versions of the ordinance. You'll see when it was at PSCC, they were called mobile dwelling units. Another thing we talked about was foundation or unfoundation dwelling units, because that's really what a lot of this comes down to. Is it on a foundation or not? And others have pointed out, well, if it's relocatable, it's on a foundation, it's not really relocatable anymore. But so there was a lot of sort of negotiating, but it really does come down to language and standardizing, both in terms of harmonizing between zoning code and building code, but also for the public, because they just want to know, like, can I do it or not? So
I think that's an addendum to the project.
So just quick timeline. In 2023, the Assembly allocated funding to the Planning Department to commission a feasibility report for new mobile home manufactured home parks in Anchorage. That was AR 2023-102S. I think the understanding then was that maybe the municipality could play a larger role in creating a new manufactured housing park, mobile home park, so that in some of these, because we have a lot of mobile home parks, none have been new ones for something like 50 years. A lot of them they need a big infrastructure upgrade. So there need to be some improvements there, and thinking about maybe the municipality could play the role in creating a new one so that people could move there while the other ones got updated or changed or something like that. In 2024, we finished the report, and the report found it just wasn't feasible to do a mobile home park. The infrastructure costs were too high. It just no longer makes a lot of sense. And we've talked about this in other discussions, that you look at where mobile home parks, manufactured home parks, relocatable dwelling unit communities are located in the Anchorage, and they were generally located on the fringe of development. And then over time, as the city grew, they became part of the center of the development. But as a housing typology, it really is something that it's sort of an aspect of 20th century development, that it located on the fringe where there was less infrastructure, it was a little bit cheaper. The roads were built to a different standard, but then over time we've grown, but we never really accommodated that and dealing with providing that type of housing for that sort of segment of the population. Anyway, so the report said it's just not feasible, and so we were kind of stuck. What should we do next?
There's a question, Mr. McKenna Foster, and I have a note for folks that lunch is available. If you want to head back, anybody. Ms. Burley.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll note the lunch is Filipino food, so I'm excited. But no, my question is just a clarifying one. So you mentioned the infrastructure cost of a new mobile home park is the biggest expense. Just off the top of your head, or maybe a follow-up, are those always private systems? Like, were they built with private infrastructure systems, or are any of them fully connected to the city system? Because I know most of the issues have been with private, like the Forest Park, trailer park up in Eagle River, for example, is a private system.
That's a great question. I think it's a range. There are some systems that are connected to public water, but maybe not, or maybe they're connected to public sewer, but not public water. So there are systems on wells, there's systems on the public system, and there's systems on the private systems. And then another aspect too is that in looking at these parks, sometimes people don't even know where the infrastructure is under the ground. So just basically, if you were looking at a big parcel, and there are a number in East Anchorage, and the East Anchorage plan called for, we want to look at what's going to happen to these areas over time. There's just, it becomes, you have no idea what's underground. You have to deal with either the new public infrastructure or fixing the old private infrastructure. So it's kind of a mix of all of those.
Okay, thanks.
So we worked with the Planning Service Department and Fire Safety, and what came from those discussions was really that we really need a way to fix what people have now. Because right now, that's the thing, you can only replace with a new mobile home, and you can't make repairs to an existing post-1976 mobile home, because that sort of, I guess maybe I should clarify that, is in 1976, the HUD created a standard, and they said any mobile homes coming out of factories are built to the standard, so they're certified. They're certified there when they leave the factory. So if you make changes to that afterwards, it sort of affects that certification, which is why most codes say you can't change that, because you might be harming the integrity of the safety and all the thinking that went into that. Pre-1976, many mobile homes were built to a different standard or a variety of standards, and so they just simply can't be moved. So even today, you can't place those anywhere, because many of them, if you look, you can still see the axles underneath. Those can't be moved and haven't been able to move just because it's generally not safe. So Building Services kind of pointed out that we need a way to be able to make modifications to existing housing that's safe, because people are making the modifications anyways, but we can't really certify it, or we can't look at it. So that became the impetus of this, is think about, rather than creating new mobile home parks, what if we just focused also on fixing what's in the existing ones, and then we can sort of take a smaller incremental step. So that was a big innovation from them, in really looking at, now you can put anything into a manufactured housing park, relocatable dwelling unit community, as long as the Building Services Department can certify it as safe. So that opens up a whole range of new types of housing that can go in there. It could be something made out of a container, if it can be certified for safe for human occupancy, or a tiny home or something like that. So, and you can make repairs as well. So really, it's allowing building services a little more sort of insight or leeway into actually inspecting some of these places and making sure they're safer. So finally, we brought this to the June 9th, 2025 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, and they recommended the item for approval. So key items of this ordinance: it renames the housing category to RDU and RDUC. It changes the use table. It expands what's allowable in PLI zones. And that's something I really want to focus on, because it is slightly different from the original intent. But as we were working through this, there were a number of other projects, including the recovery residences. And we saw this as a way they're thematically similar, and bring those together as one sort of set of amendments. And it allows smaller lot sizes in RDUCs, but requires the placement of new units to consider the state of existing sewer and water infrastructure. And that sort of new added line between PCC and the Assembly came directly from meeting with the Alaska Mobile Homeowners Renters Association, because they said, well, this is great, but what happens if an owner wants to just pack these things in and our systems don't work? If it's an AWU system, AWU is there, and they can sort of make that determination. But if it's a private system, the previous ordinance didn't really have that in there. So we just added that you can't add something in without sort of verifying that the infrastructure can handle it. So feedback generally positive, both from people living in manufactured housing communities or RDUCs, and from people who own and operate them. A lot of people excited, say, great, we can now put units back in where we haven't been able to because the lot size didn't meet it. And as I mentioned, multiple meetings and multiple calls from park operators interested in upgrading units or replacing old units. And so just to really emphasize, this is the use table, and these are the use table changes highlighted. So you'll see there are some changes. There are changes to habilitative care and transitional living. And so I just want to make sure that that's a bigger proposal than what was initially came out of the report, and it came out of initial discussions. And a lot of that was, as we were working on the recovery residences project, thinking about, would this kind of thing fit? Could these be considered relocatable dwelling units? And it was sort of building in that flexibility, so those conversations can proceed, and this wouldn't be the obstacle. And then, and it does, you'll note that it allows relocatable dwelling units and relocatable dwelling communities in PLI as a permitted use. So that's also a big change. But there, again, the thinking is any use of PLI land is probably going to have a lot more scrutiny on it, a lot more investment or involvement from the higher levels. So, any questions?
Probably had a question.
Thanks. Actually, I thought I'd saw Ms. Baldwin Day, but maybe you didn't have a question. But so, yeah, it was for her.
Ms. Baldwin Day.
So I just wanna clarify what I think I heard you say is that, anything prior to 1975, any mobile home prior to that date can't be moved or modified by the existing rules. Like either one of those things are prohibited.
Through the chair, generally, yes, and I think 1976 is the cutoff date. So right now, if I had a 1978 manufactured home in a park, I could move it, and the code would say that would allow. If it was built in 1960, they would say you just can't move this structure anymore. One, because we can't certify it safe, and for now they don't have the means to certify it, whether it's a mobile home built in a factory or not, as safe. So yeah, right now nothing. So I think a lot of people, when they think of a manufactured home, they think of something from the 1950s. And what we said thread is that you couldn't move those anywhere anyway. Somebody couldn't just drop that in because it can't be certified as safe. And
Gotcha.
it hasn't been able to in existing code and in this code.
This change to the use table also contemplates, beyond the micro units for recovery, other entities that might be interested in, say, dropping 2 or 3 RDUs in an available parking lot or something like that. Like this would open the door for other entities, but to potentially host transitional living spaces on a smaller scale.
Through the chair, potentially, because a lot of that would depend if it's allowed as an accessory use to the primary use. So this does open the door to that conversation, but as we're looking at the recovery residences, we're thinking also like, well, how do you cite some of these things, and in with the temporary use discussion as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can yet, but those are still pieces we're working out.
Yeah, I think I would be really interested concurrently with the conversations that the mayor is hosting with, for example, faith communities who are interested in replicating in our backyard or something similar. I think I'd be really interested to stay abreast of how those conversations are developing and how potentially further adjustment to the use table might be required to make that possible for faith communities who want to be supportive of our community in that way.
Through the chair, thank you. We'll note that, and we are looking at the accessory use table and thinking about how could maybe some of these be as accessory, but currently they're not listed as accessory uses. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. Just can you give us a little bit more of the background around the decision of the relocatable meets a foundation or not? It seems like the original early intent would have been relocatables permissible because they're relocatable. A permanent foundation is not necessarily connected to the relocatable, so it doesn't have to be permanently attached to the foundation. There just need to be a foundation there. Seems to me that that's a different that's a choice that maybe adds a barrier. Can you just get a little bit more of how that emerged as the right choice or the choice from planning?
Yeah, through the chair. So yeah, initially, the proposal would have allowed relocatable dwelling units without a foundation as an accessory or as an accessory dwelling unit. It was pretty clear about that. But we got some comments from building services and I believe we put this in the assembly memo, and I'm going to pull it up in a second here, that building services saw some issues with that, with how they would categorize how the two units work together. I'll look it up and I might follow up on that.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, actually, that was primarily my question about foundations. But I think the follow-up is, can you also talk a little bit more about why foundations are the key piece of, whether something's considered relocatable or not? I mean, I think it's, and I'll just preface by saying it is a really important distinction. And it's generally how we define real property is my understanding versus what we call personal property. But so maybe you could just talk a little bit more about foundations, because that's been a big discussion with the building department as well. When something is a housing unit versus these what are considered temporary, but often aren't.
Yeah, through the chair, and that really was, and for a while we were considering, should we just say foundation units or unfoundationed units? I think it comes down to both building code and assessing as well. It becomes an issue of how do you assess a property if it doesn't have a foundation unit on it or not. And I'm just looking, and so I have maybe this will speak to both of these, but so we said the original ordinance allowed mobile dwelling units, now relocatable dwellings under zoning code to be used as accessory dwellings without a foundation. The version provided with this new version changes it to require relocatable dwelling units used as an ADUs to have a foundation. This is due to the specifics of building codes requiring ADUs to have a foundation in case something happens to the original primary structure and the ADU becomes the main structure on the lot. I think maybe that's what it was, is that you have a primary structure that has a foundation and then accessory structure that doesn't. If the first one burns down, then you have this, it's not a temporary use, it's a permanent use, but without a foundation, and it can be moved and so I think that's where it became sort of difficult. And I wish Greg Soule or Daniel King were here because they could explain it better. But it is possible to allow dwelling units without foundations on regular residential lots, but it would require a different category of regulation to meet building code requirements. So I can follow up with them and bring additional meeting information to the subsequent meeting, I think.
Okay, and just to be clear, also, you can have what somebody would consider a mobile home or a manufactured unit, but you can still put it on a foundation, right? It's not an either or. And I think Mr. Martinez spoke to that. It's a choice with implications, but is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair. And as others pointed out, then it's not really relocatable anymore, but that's sort of the way it is. And that was also what people say, so I can do manufactured home housing or mobile housing. It really is, once it gets onto a foundation, it's really just a dwelling unit. So.
Anyone else on that? Nope. Okay.
Again, Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning, now talking about nonconformities ordinance. This is AO 2025-94. This is a really big ordinance, a really complicating ordinance. It's one of the most confusing and complicated chapters in the code, but it's a really important chapter because it has a lot to do with existing rights and sort of standardizing rights. And so it's pretty crucial. I guess thinking about where to even begin, in planning, we work in building and zoning code. And in many of these discussions, especially for the public, people maybe don't see the difference between that. So I just want to emphasize that building code is focused on the physical safety of buildings and structures and comes from a process of building officials and then adoption. Zoning code, which is what the nonconformities chapter we're looking at is part of, is focused on how buildings and uses relate to each other on properties and among properties. And it comes from a public process and then adoption. So building code and zoning code are created in really different ways, and they also are used in very different ways, even though for most people they look to be one and the same. And then finally, zoning code, it sort of sets the parameters of proper categories and relationships in space. I've heard this best described as sort of zoning code is sort of a moral geography. It sort of tells us what's appropriate, what's right, where people want certain activities to be or not to be. And so I just put that in terms of thinking about conformities. It's as much a question of sometimes the culture of the place or the culture of the time as it is about the health, safety, welfare, which is the legal basis for zoning. And just some examples of that is you'll see all across the municipality, we do have zoning that doesn't necessarily line up with what the seismic quality of the soils are or where the infrastructure is. But zoning often represents maybe something else. It's sort of, in many ways, a snapshot of the community at the time. And it says a lot about the priorities of the community and the values of the community. Here's another example of whenever you see sort of a little piece of zoning that doesn't really seem to fit with something else, there's probably a story there, and it's probably coming out of a different set of values or a very unique problem at that time. That zoning is sort of a rigid system, even though our society is sort of flowing and moving and adapting, and zoning doesn't always adapt to that, and that kind of gets us to nonconformity. So what problems is AO 2024-594 trying to solve? One, make it easier to make internal and small external repairs and fixes without being required to make large-scale changes to the property to make existing zoning code. So the current sort of philosophy behind the nonconformities code in Title 21 is everything should always be coming into conformity with the most current version of the code. So the expectation is that over time, everything will ultimately be in alignment with what the code says now. And this is interesting because Anchorage has thousands and thousands of properties, and we have no idea how many nonconformities there are. And we have no idea what it would take to get to that. But that's sort of the underlying philosophy of the code, is that over time, everything should be coming into conformity. So one issue with this is if somebody comes to the permit center and they say, I'd like to do X, Y, and Z on my property. When we do our review, we look at it and you say, well, there are a number of things about this building that don't line up with zoning code. And so the code directs us to say, well, you need to make these other changes to bring everything to conformance, either partially or completely, before you can do this. So, people say, oh, I want to redo my roof. And say, well, your driveway is actually too wide or not wide enough. So you need to fix that as well. And that, from what we've heard, has been a deterrent to people trying to make improvements to their property, because it places this burden of, I want to make a small fix, but I'm being required to do a bigger fix. And that sometimes they make the changes anyway, and then it doesn't get permitted. So maybe it isn't as safe. And so that is an issue. And this is sort of bringing that to light, make it a little bit easier for people to make small changes to improve their properties, to keep their properties in good shape, rather than sort of getting them on this. We're going to make sure you hit all the conformity with every single project. And so a big piece of this is changing the threshold at which properties are required to make the big property-wide changes. Currently, if you're doing a project and I think you exceed 10% of the value of the property, if your project is bigger than, say you have a $100,000 house, let's say, and you're doing a $11,000 project, this would require you now that's the threshold for you have to do more repairs. Part of this AO is saying go up to 50%. So your $100,000 house, you're doing $40,000 worth of work. You don't have to go, because you're below that 50% threshold, you wouldn't have to go through that same bringing everything up to code. Any questions on that?
None. Oh, and Mr. Johnson.
That calculation, the 10 or 50%, is that just on the structure itself, right? Not the total value, assessed value of the property?
It might,
Through the chair, it might be the assessed value of the property, or it might be the assessed value of the structure. I'll double check.
I guess it's, and probably maybe it's not something we need to necessarily contemplate here, but it sort of raises an interesting question. $100,000 house on $1 million lot,
right?
Would have a much different picture in terms of when you hit the threshold versus something more typical.
It is structure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, with that, and so we, Member Brawley sent us some ideas for proposed amendments. Our understanding is one would add language about mitigating burdens created by policies that require movement towards conformity, allow foundations existing for 2014 to remain in place, be considered conforming, and allow a waiver for the as-built requirement for small encroachments to the setback if staff can do a review based on aerial imagery before 1968. So we've talked with Land Use Review because they do a lot of this stuff. We do have some comments on that or suggestions about things to consider. We could address that now, or if Member Broad, however you'd like us to proceed on that.
Yeah, if I could speak briefly to the amendments.
go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I recognize also we're not getting into debate, but I want to kind of say why I'm bringing these, because I think it's really important to understanding the bigger issue, and it's bigger than this ordinance really, but it's partly what this underlying ordinance is trying to solve. So for at least a year, I've been trying to track down how do we make it easier to reuse existing buildings. So whether it's the same use, different use, and one of the things I kept hearing is that nonconformities and the need for a nonconforming determination, which requires going to the city, getting a permit or getting a determination and paying a fee, was stopping, for example, a lot of accessory dwelling units being built. There's a few dozen of them, I think, that didn't get built in 2020, summer 2024, because they did not get this determination in time, and there was not time to put in a foundation for whatever addition or new structure they were building. So this is a real problem. But when I was digging in, my understanding is the biggest issue of these is is encroachments in setbacks. And so, and that can be different things. It could be a shed, et cetera. But when we're talking about a building, so then I started digging real deep in the zoning code. So first to say nonconformities is not just something Anchorage made up. It is actually a very deeply built in function of zoning code, which as Mr. McKenna Foster said, they want everything to conform eventually. So they're not saying go do it tomorrow, but when you touch the property, you're not allowed to just keep it conforming. You're not allowed to expand that nonconformity. You are supposed to move to conformity. So that is the whole kind of general logic of zoning code. So it's really hard to dig into that and easily undo it or change it, is what I found. I looked back in the 1946 zoning code just for the city, not the borough. It's online somewhere. And the 20-foot front setback for residential properties is in there. So some of these setbacks have been around for a long time, because I thought, well, maybe these are new and then people were building before that happened. So in the city, at least, that's not the case. In the borough, I would argue that probably was the case, because there wasn't a whole lot of zoning, if any, in the borough for pre 1975. So I think some of these came from the fact that we became one government, and then we applied one set of land use rules. And I imagine there was a whole bunch of conflict at the time about that. But in this case, I also went back to the Title 21 rewrite and looked at the P&Z discussion on this chapter, because they went chapter by chapter. And I found there was actually not a lot of changes made to the non-conforming chapter. So we know there's a lot of things that were added to zoning code, but not all of it changed. And in fact, a lot of our setbacks didn't change either. They are the same as they were in 1982, and in some cases in 1946. However, like I said, a lot of things were built outside of the purview of that code. So also there was a lot of discussion back then about the issue of setbacks, actually, interestingly, with mobile homes and other regular homes. So this is an ongoing kind of discussion that's happened. Anyway, it's interesting. I put in an AIM that pulled out some of those pieces. So that's just for information. But really the discussion came down to, how do we bring properties into conformity? Some of the commissioners were very hard line and said, no, everything needs to conform. How can we make sure that happens? And then the discussion about the practicality of that, the biggest of which is, are we going to make a lot of people move their foundation, physically dig out a piece of and move the foundation and move the building? Because that is one of the biggest expenses. It was said on the record at the time. And again, what is practical? And so all of this to say, my amendments, I was trying to solve the issue, but I'm not sure that it's easily solvable. And I've been working with planning on what the options are. But the fundamental truth is that we both have a code that by design wants us to come into conformity, and there's reasons for that. And also we have a whole bunch of buildings that are sitting on foundations that we can't physically move without a lot of cost to the owner. And the nonconformities code says that it is the burden of the owner to bring a property into conformity. So it's, that's again, baked into the code. That's how it normally works. So all that to say, I've looked at ideas like previously conforming. There's other cities that have said, okay, if you conformed at the time, we're going to treat you differently than if you had built it wrong in the first place. That would take, I think, kind of a step back and rewrite of the chapter. So I'm not proposing that here. And I was trying to solve the problem of, how do we make sure that setbacks or encroachments in setbacks are not getting in the way of these things. But again, it's really difficult, because there might be buildings that actually cross property lines, right? There's a whole bunch of other things when you start digging into it. So all of that to say, I've offered these. Going to continue to work with the planning department. I'm not sure, other than this purpose statement, which is just really trying to, again, get at the balance between, we want everything to conform, but also we recognize we live in the real world and these things were built. And then the other two, again, are just two attempts to solve that problem. And I will say, it's not in the amendment, but it's interesting. If you look at Amendment 2, this non-conforming structures, there's a piece of that code that says basically, if a building was built too tall, because there were height requirements put on in the Title 21 rewrite that didn't exist before. So if buildings were too tall, they were grandfathered in. So what I did was and also if a building was too far from the property line, it violated the maximum setback, those were grandfathered in. So I was attempting to figure out if we could do that the other way, if they violate the minimum. So that's what Amendment 2 does. But all of that to say, this is a much bigger problem. And so I'm contemplating kind of how to move forward. But I also want to say, I don't want to hold up this ordinance, because I think it's a practical practical solution to allow us to move forward without having to rewrite the non-conforming or rethink what non-conforming is. So that's the big picture. Thank you.
Ms. Bolunden.
So do nonconformities have, I mean, is there a hierarchy of nonconformities? I mean, are there, how much of this, when we talk about nonconformities, are we talking about things that actually pertain to like life, health, safety issues versus aesthetics or changing preferences in like design? I mean, what is the balance that we're really dealing with here? Because I guess I appreciate that the code wants everything to come into conformity, but if conformity is arbitrary and less about life, health and safety than it is about aesthetics, then that, I don't know, that feels like a moving target and also maybe not the most efficient use of our bandwidth. I don't know. Go ahead.
Through the chair, great question. Really difficult to answer because in some cases, as Member Brawley mentioned, that nonconformity could be a building built over a lot line, and then you have sort of a legal issue, and that you're kind of impinging on somebody else's rights. In other cases, it might just be that this house is 7 feet back and needs to be 10 feet back, and it's hard to find a health, safety, welfare rationale for why that needs to be. But at the same time, say the driveway is only 12 feet, traffic might make the argument that, well, a wider driveway is easier for us to get traffic flow moving, and that's a safety issue. So I would say it's a range, but a lot of zoning is addressing things that maybe could be addressed in other places, but some of the nonconformities that are also in zoning are health safety issues. So it is hard to say, is this one, is this a tier 1 conformity? So that's easy and that one isn't. It is kind of case by case, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder also, it might be helpful for members, I sort of understand it, but can you, Mr. McKenna Foster, talk about what the notice of zoning deficiency, like what the basic policy change that the planning department has put forward? That's not a code change, but it's also trying to address kind of when someone comes to the department and is trying to do something and has a driveway that's too wide or whatever it is.
Yeah, through the chair. So recently the director sort of established some new policy guidance that if, say, in the process of you're just investigating your property, you're looking into a project and we are helping with that, or maybe we're doing a formal review of it and we find something that's, oh, this is a violation, rather than sort of starting a process to say, now this needs, you have to fix this. It's more of saying, we noted this exists and we want you to be aware it also exists. So it's a little bit of a different approach to finding nonconformities, rather than saying there's a nonconformity and the code directs us to really pursue bringing it back into conformity, but just saying this is a nonconformity and we just want the information to be there that it exists.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. And then I'll add, I think the other piece of it is when would you need to take action on that? And it's really when the property sells. So it's something that goes with the property. And it's not the same as, but in the HOA world with condos, like for example, our board, the HOA that I sit on, if there's an immediate violation an owner needs to fix and it's a safety issue, we, or the roof is falling and whatever it is, we address that. If it's something where they aren't, following the deeds and covenants or whatever, but it's not a life safety issue, that goes on file as a notice of violation in their record. And then when the property sells, they're required to bring that up to standard before it sells. So the mechanism to get that done is often through property sale. So this isn't the same thing, but it sounds like a general equivalent. So it's a not right now thing, but again, when the property changes hands, these are things you would have to address.
Foster.
And if I could, I'm just looking at the policy, and the policy says the director will not issue a notice for the following: encroachments into stream protection setbacks or other setbacks established for protection of environmentally sensitive areas, such as slopes or wetlands, encroachments into drainage easements, encroachments into setbacks that adversely impact neighboring properties, encroachments into front yard setbacks or adversely impact snow removal operations, trash service, or obstruct sightlines for vehicular traffic or prohibited uses.
Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, question. Looking at the proposed amendments, is there anything in here that you would flag as maybe where the language doesn't meet the intent, or anything that may create implementation issues, or anything that you think we should be mindful of as we contemplate these?
Through the chair, zoning land use review did look at it, and they had a couple of notes on amendment 1. Some of that language, were lawful before the effective date applicable. They said the beginning of the paragraph states uses, structures, lots, and signs are legal prior to the date of this title. Therefore, the proposed edit above is expressing what has been previously mentioned. So maybe that language is clarifying, but maybe not necessarily needed. For amendment 2, the comment is that the maximum setback is a current code requirement. So you have legal non-conforming rights prior to current code if you establish those. I'll just go to it here. And by adding a word minimum to the sentence, you're saying no setbacks are required to building prior to 2014. So you would be legalizing a wide range of properties there. And then for amendment 3, there are a couple issues. And this one is tough because an as-built is expensive. And we know that, to get a surveyor to come out to your property, that's no small cost. But it also provides the certainty about what is actually going on the lot, because our imagery is awesome. Our GIS whole program does a great job, but sometimes the lines aren't perfect. You can't tell exactly what's going on from an aerial image. The plot plans are really, really useful. Another issue too is that to require construction before 1986, I believe we have imagery from 1990 and 1980. So it would be hard to make that determination. I don't know if we have specific imagery. So it might be more helpful to say, prior to 1990 or prior to 1980, so we could be certain that it wasn't, done in 1987. So aerial imagery is an overlay. It doesn't depict the exact location of structures on a property. So we would need some sort of plot plan, whether it's an as-built or not, because as-built is a little more intensive. As-built are not required for interior improvements, which is good. And staff does not recommend waiving the requirement for a new detached structure to meet code based on construction of the existing building. And then there was a question, would this amendment pertain to both residential and commercial development? And the planning director did mention that she has a meeting planned with Member Brawley to maybe work through some of these. But I think we agree there was a lot of support of this at planning and zoning, and a lot of other people would be. So it seems like there are a lot of good proposals here, and these, I think we can probably work some of them out, but it might be between the director and.
Yeah, I'll just say for my part, I'm not expecting that these stay as they are. Again, they're kind of working through, and I mostly wanted to put this really big issue of setbacks on the table. But yeah, I'm going to continue to work with planning. So whatever you see on the 21st is going to probably look different than this, but it's trying to solve the same problem. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let me just, I think I'll wait for the most part to see the end product, but you mentioned in amendment number 2, the addition of minimum to the setbacks that would be permitted, and that it would legalize, I think you said, a wide range of structures. Can you maybe kind of explain a little bit further what would actually the change would be in effect?
So our understanding, the way it's written, is that it would potentially legalize any sort of all setback nonconformities before 2014, built before then. And that's a lot of our housing stock. I think most of our housing stock was built before then. So it would affect a lot of properties. So it's a pretty significant change.
So I have a question there. So you have a building that has too much or too little setbacks and it's non-conforming. The building is there. So what happens in the future if they're forced to come into compliance with the code? They can't. The building is there. So what changes?
The system the way it works now is in that situation, we would direct, if somebody comes in, they say, do I have conformity or not? We say, you have to go through the process to determine if you have non-conforming rights or not. And then we would do the review, and then they establish if they do or they don't. If they don't, then it does become a problem. It's like, is the municipality going to require people to change where their foundation is?
No, but what comes to mind is the property built right into the heart of the section line easement on Campbell Lake. That is surely non-conforming. Forever it will be non-conforming. Are we going to ask him to finally move the property that he has there like we should? Or are we just going to accept it? Are we coming up with a term? Are we going to make him go through the process, which probably he should, right? I don't know. So that's the one that's very specific and concrete to me, is like this guy who apparently got away with or maybe the previous owner got away with, and the title companies didn't reproduce the flaw. But this property that's like squarely in the middle of a place that it could never be conforming unless it was granted some state law change. I'm trying to be specific. Like, let's talk about a property, not any universe of properties.
Quite honestly, that sounds like a pretty high level.
Sounds like an Allison
Policy
question.
question.
An Allison,
Maybe a
you can't
legal
answer off the fly, I
question.
know. So my Allison, for the record, I mean an attorney question. So, but you don't need to riff off the top of your head. It's an unfair question. Yeah. So she's noting for the record that she's not aware of that project. I don't want to put you on the spot, Allison. First Anna, then Zach.
Yeah, just to briefly respond to that. So when I was digging back, and my understanding is there's what exists now. If you're trying to change it, that triggers these things. If you try to expand it, like let's say you're non-conforming and you're trying to put an addition on your house, or you're putting it in the setback, you're trying to expand the non-conformity, that's not allowed. A lot of the discussion at P&Z during the rewrite, and by the way, January 1st, 2014 is the date that the new code went into effect. A lot of the discussion was actually about destruction of properties and like if it burns down, can you put it back where it was? And so that's actually really that's what a lot of this does. It says this can be here now as it exists. And then if it burns down or you have to, whatever, you need to remodel it, that's when you're legally not allowed to just put it back where it was. So if you just grant that this nonconformity can exist forever, that's the implication is you take a building that's nonconforming and then you can rebuild it there. So if that guy's property burned down,
Is that what this does?
it would change the legal status of it. So it is a big change.
So it would make it. This amendment would make it so that those uses would, even though they were kind of non-conforming, would be allowed forever. They would be able to rebuild.
Yeah, and that's why this has been so difficult and why I'm not necessarily pushing what it's written.
Okay, yeah, because I could see a number of ways an abusive builder or developer would use this as a means of, and here's another specific example. There's a property down in Bootlegger's Cove. I forget the name of the building. It's Mariner's View. The builder at the time, it's back in the 80s, came in on a Friday, bulldozed onto the railroad right of way, laid his foundation, and essentially stole from the right of way of the railroad and then paid them money and permanently got away with it. And that's the kind of behavior that this might seem to incentivize. Getting away with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Thank you. Now it's starting to make sense to me. Mr. Martinez. Yeah. And then Ms. Baldwin Day.
Right, I know we're almost at time, and this is a little bit of a backwards question. I have the echo of something you said, and I wanted to make sure I heard it accurately, and then maybe have a better understanding of what it is in the first place. You mentioned when the conversation around the relocatables and the permanent foundation and that discussion that Member Brawley and myself were talking about. During that portion, you mentioned that the decision was essentially framed around a permanent home, the main residential unit has a permanent foundation. And so if that burned down was the scenario that I think you gave, if something happened to that main home, then the secondary unit would become the main home, which then in the building code folks think that's why a permanent foundation would be required on the accessory unit. I think you made that connection to if something happened to the primary, then the secondary would become the primary, and that's why they would want a foundation. Is that the logic that was presented?
Yeah, my understanding is that it boils down to an issue of building code. And I think Daniel King did provide a memo on it. I don't know if it made it into our, maybe in a packet. I'm going to dig that up and see if I can circulate it because he can speak to it better than I can.
Thank you.
Ms. Baldwin Day.
Yeah, I think I want to come back to this question of minimum or maximum structure setbacks. So I think what I'm hearing is that including this kind of language would sort of permanently legalize structures that have like seriously encroached in right of way or like other, like that's the worst case scenario, is that we permanently legalize those structures, and if they burn down or if something happens, they would have the legal right to rebuild in the same place in the same fashion. Is that the like worst case scenario?
Through the chair, yeah, if it was pre-2014, they would have that right.
Do we have an idea, even like a ballpark, a range of how many properties in Anchorage with that degree of like problematic placement that this would affect?
Through the chair, I don't think anybody has any idea how many potential nonconformities. This is this chart on the board here shows just the thousands of single family residences built by the year built, and then sort of the first red line is Municipality of Anchorage consolidation. So that's when there was a pretty big regulatory change, and then new Girdwood codes. Actually, in some of the analysis we did, with a lot of nonconformities come out of Girdwood. So when the Girdwood code changed, we see a lot there. And then new Title 21, 2014. So the majority of our stuff was built before our current codes. Now, some of the codes were exactly the same, as member probably pointed out, but it just seems like the chance that there are many out there is pretty high.
And a follow-on question to that. So I'm again stuck on the one concept. There are an infinite probably array of nonconformities, but in this one, the builder has a property built either in a right of way on their property, a public right of way, or other element like that. Do these same conforming rules allowing to become conforming by virtue of the code also apply when the taking is on public lands or rights of way?
I think I'd lean back and say, I don't think zoning is powerful enough to do that. So if there was a violation of a public right of way, then it sort of does jump outside of zoning. And if it's crossing a property line too, then you are like, I don't think zoning can legalize a property line encroachment. But this isn't necessarily that clear about it. I think it just doesn't contemplate that. But that was my first take. It can't just say, oh, it took it and now we have to resurvey it or replat that
So
lot.
I think that there are a number of cases you could look at in which a petitioner asserts that. We might have one ongoing right now. And so it might be good to make very explicit somewhere in this document for the reader what the standard is there on public lands, because I could see how this could grant someone the thinking they could act in this way, or that their land from 2002 construction did that, and they suddenly have some special right or privilege. And so it might be wise to clarify the limitations. Anyone else?
So does this amendment require the building to have been legal at the time that it was erected? Like, were the setbacks at the time that it was built required to be legal? Or is it just anything before 2014?
Yeah, I can answer that, but I won't have the only answer. One of them is in an older version of the code, it would refer to things that were lawful at the time. So I tried to bring that language forward, but that gets more complicated too. So my understanding is that it doesn't distinguish between those things, and then trying to do that to say there's this idea of previously conforming. Were you conforming to an old code? And I've started to chase that down, but it's just a different way of doing it than what we've done. So the language in the amendment doesn't do that. It doesn't distinguish between those. And to do that would actually be a lot more work, as I've found. So I don't know if you have a different or more information.
No, through the chair, I think as your amendment, it's sort of however you would like to clarify that. And
I guess the question would be, does the code itself contemplate between previously conforming versus, or like if it was lawful at the time versus illegal to begin with?
I don't think it does, but I need to ask Sonnet, because our code doesn't have like an amnesty. I used to work in Kodiak, and Kodiak had an amnesty date, and it said if it was built before this time, it doesn't matter if it was done legally or not. After that, it was like it had to be built when it was legal at that time, and our code isn't there. And Mr. Chair, if I can make one final comment, Mr. Martinez, there is a memo. It's from Building Services. It's 2 pages long on exactly what you're talking about. It's probably easier for me to forward that than try to read it here. Yep.
A couple more minutes, anyone? Well, thank you. We've had a work session today on 2025-112, 2025-94. Both of these are coming forward soon or on the agenda now. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back here, I think at, is it, yeah, 1:15 for our next work session. Thank you.